Bertrand Russell's theory of descriptions is a theory about descriptions, which are pieces of language seemingly used to indicate objects by way of their properties. For example, the description, "the wall you can see behind me," is a description used to indicate this wall. Russell presents his theory in his landmark article on denoting, and in it he justifies the theory in two ways. First, by attacking two alternative theories as put forward by Alexius Meinong and Gottlob Frege, and second, as a way to solve three philosophical puzzles. In this video, instead of diving right in to explain Russell's somewhat complicated theory, I'm first going to briefly explain the two theories he seeks to replace and why he thinks they are unsuitable. Without understanding this, you don't really know the context in which Russell presents his own theory. Once that's done, I'll then explain what Russell's theory is and how it works, and then finally go on to apply his theory to the three philosophical puzzles. So let's go. Meinong and Frege were contemporaries of Russell, and each of them took definite descriptions, which are descriptions that begin with the word "the", at face value, believing them to denote objects directly. Now this is a very natural way of thinking, because definite descriptions often appear to denote the subject or the object of sentences. For example, in the sentence, "The British Prime Minister visited the Queen of England," the words "the British Prime Minister" appear to denote the subject of the sentence. This subject is the particular person that fits the description, in this case Boris Johnson, who is then said to have visited the Queen of England. And the words "the Queen of England" are also a definite description, used to indicate the object of the sentence, which is Queen Elizabeth II. Because of this, it seems as though the words "the British Prime Minister" and "Boris Johnson" are just different ways of denoting the same person. Similarly with "the Queen of England" and Queen Elizabeth II. As intuitive as this idea of definite descriptions might be, Russell is going to challenge its assumptions, and part of that requires him to undermine the more natural view of things by attacking the views of Meinong and Frege. Russell begins his attack with Meinong. Now Meinong's theory is unusual in that he believes that definite descriptions always denote objects that indeed have the properties described of them. He thinks this because according to Meinong's theory, the denotation of a description is the meaning it contributes to the sentence. So if a definite description had no denotation, that would make the sentence meaningless. But if every definite description has a denotation, then even a description like "the hobbit that brought the One Ring to Mount Doom" really does denote an object that is a hobbit that brought the One Ring to Mount Doom. And descriptions that seem impossible, such as "the round square", also denote objects, in this case something both round and square. Russell rejects Meinong's theory mainly because it leads to contradiction. The round square is said to be both round and square, and since square things are not round, that means the round square is both round and not round at the same time, which is a contradiction. Similarly, anything that does not exist but is described as existing must both be existing and yet not exist at the same time. For example, in Meinong's theory, the definite description "the existing golden mountain" must denote an object that is an existing golden mountain. But since there are no golden mountains, this thing must both be existing and yet not exist at the same time, which Russell thinks is a contradiction. Now, Meinong did reply to the objections Russell raises in On Denoting. He said that as for the round square, things that don't exist can be contradictory. So the round square can be both round and not round at the same time. And as regards the existing golden mountain, Meinong said that there's a difference between existing and having existence. So it's possible for the existing golden mountain not to exist. Russell didn't find Meinong's reply very convincing and simply said he had nothing more to say on the matter. Frege's theory, like Meinong's, takes definite descriptions to directly denote, or in his theory refer to, objects. But unlike Russell and Meinong, Frege has a two-layered theory of meaning, whereby words have a sense as well as a reference. If you want to know more details about this theory, I've done a long video of it which I've put in the card above me. Now, Frege's two-layered theory of meaning means that descriptions can have a sense without needing to also have a reference. so he doesn't face the same problems that Meinong has to face in trying to explain how all descriptions are meaningful. His answer is that all descriptions have a sense, and that it is the sense that contributes to what is expressed in the sentence and not the reference. For example, Frege thinks the description, "the hobbit that brought the One Ring to Mount Doom," means what it seems to. Its sense is the understanding of that description you have in your head when hearing it. But since there is no object that fits that description, the description fails to refer to anything. So although Frege thinks many descriptions like the Queen of England have both a sense and a reference, some, like the round square, have only a sense. In On Denoting, Russell presents a long and very confusing argument against Frege's sense-reference distinction, which is called his Gray's elegy argument. Now, this argument is very difficult to make sense of and completely mischaracterizes Frege's theory anyway, so I won't go into it here. Papers on the topic for those interested are linked in the description. But Russell does make a valid passing point for any theory like Frege's in which there might be descriptions that fail to refer to something. Frege said that sentences that contain descriptions that fail to refer cannot be either true or false. So it is neither true nor false that Frodo was the hobbit that brought the One Ring to Mount Doom. This position follows from both his compositional view of a sentence's sense and reference, see the video I did on the topic for details, and it also follows from his commitment to a fundamental logical principle that says that if a sentence is false, then the opposite sentence, its negation, must be true. So in Frege's theory, if it were false that Frodo was the hobbit that brought the One Ring to Mount Doom, then it must be true that Frodo was not the hobbit that brought the One Ring to Mount Doom. But neither of these seem to be true because hobbits don't exist. So Frege instead says that sentences that have elements that do not refer are neither true nor false. For more details on Frege's views about non-reference, you can see my open access paper on the topic linked in the description. Now, Frege's theory seems fine at first, but it does result in some problems, because there will then be some sentences that clearly seem to be true that can turn out not to be. For example, consider the sentence, "If my bag has one thing in it, then the thing in my bag is in my bag." Even though this is an odd thing to say, it seems as though it should be true no matter what. But if my bag is empty, then the definite description, "the thing in my bag," would have no reference, and this would mean, on Frege's theory, that the sentence would then be neither true nor false, and so not true. But how could it not be true that if my bag has one thing in it, then that thing is in my bag? With Meinong's and Frege's theories shown to be less than perfect, we now have at least some reason to think we need a better theory of descriptions. So let's turn to see what Russell proposes. I'm now going to explain Russell's theory. At first it might be hard to see what the point of it is, but once his theory is understood, I'm then going to apply it to the philosophical puzzles that Russell does, which shows why his theory is both relevant and philosophically interesting. So bear with me on this. Russell's approach is to abandon the natural idea that descriptions refer to objects. He theorizes that instead they have a complex logical form very different to their natural language grammar. He ultimately replaces descriptions with complex logical machinery involving variables, quantifiers, predicates, identity, and conditionals. Now this can get quite confusing quite quickly, but in this video I'm instead going to focus on natural language examples to help make his theory intuitively clear first, and only after that introduce his logical notation. Now, descriptions come in two broad types. First, there are indefinite descriptions that indicate some general member of a category. And second, there are definite descriptions that indicate specific things. Indefinite descriptions typically start with the word a and include phrases like a horse, a number, or a pipe-smoking Cambridge philosopher. Definite descriptions, on the other hand, typically start with the, such as the fastest horse in the world, the even prime number, or the pipe-smoking Cambridge philosopher called Bertrand Russell. Russell first looks at indefinite descriptions. Consider the sentence, "A horse ran past me." As with definite descriptions, it is natural to think that the indefinite description, "a horse," denotes an object, i.e. some horse, and that it is this that is the subject of the sentence that is said to have ran past me. But Russell thinks that indefinite descriptions do not denote the objects directly. Instead, "a horse ran past me" would be more accurately expressed by saying, something is such that it is a horse and it ran past me. Note that in this new sentence, the subject is not a horse, but simply an indefinite something. And this something can be described both as being a horse and as having ran past me. So the indefinite description, a horse, is really no different in terms of its meaning and role to the words ran past me. Both describe properties of the subject of the sentence. Thus, Russell takes the word something in his alternative sentence to be the true denoting term and not the original indefinite description, a horse. The difference between definite and indefinite descriptions on Russell's theory is that definite descriptions imply something more, namely that there is only one object that fits the description. Since this is part of what is implied when we use definite descriptions, Russell wants to make sure that his theory captures it. Consider a new example sentence. The author of On Denoting is a pipe smoker. Russell wrote On Denoting and Russell smokes a pipe, so this sentence is true. But how is it true? On Frege's theory, it's because the definite description, the author of On Denoting, refers to Russell. And since Russell is a pipe smoker, the sentence is true. But Russell wants to pull a similar trick with this sentence as he did with the case of indefinite descriptions. Russell's theory translates the natural language, the author of On Denoting is a pipe smoker, to the more clunky, but he thinks more accurate, something is such that it wrote on denoting and nothing else wrote on denoting and it is a pipe smoker. We see then that in Russell's theory, simple claims which have descriptions in subject position make more than one claim about their subject. The sentence, the author of On Denoting is a pipe smoker, makes three claims about its subject. First, that it is an author of On Denoting. Second, that it is the only author of On Denoting. And third, that it is a pipe smoker. Now that you understand the ideas behind Russell's theory, I'm going to introduce the logical notation that Russell uses to generalize these ideas to all sentences. For indefinite descriptions, we can take a simple general case to be of the form an F is G, which Russell renders as something is both F and G. In logical notation, this is written as follows, which can be read as saying there exists an X such that X is F and X is G. If we were to apply this analysis to the horse example, it would change a horse ran past me to there exists an X such that X is a horse and X ran past me. For definite descriptions, we can take a simple general case to be of the form the F is G, which Russell renders as something is F and nothing else is F and it is also G. The way to say nothing else is F in logical notation requires a little trick. It must be said that anything else that is F is identical to the thing already said to be F. The reason is because logical languages use identity claims to quantify numbers of objects. So in logical notation, it would be translated as follows. This logical sentence can be read as saying, there exists an X such that X is F, and if anything is F, it must be identical to X, and X is also G. Applying this notation to our example sentence, the author of On Denoting is a pipe smoker, we would get, there exists an X such that X is an author of On Denoting, and if anything else is an author of On Denoting, it must be identical to X, and X is also a pipe smoker. This theory may seem very fancy and perhaps unnecessarily complicated, but its real power, according to Russell, comes in its ability to solve philosophical puzzles. So let's turn to them now. The first philosophical puzzle that Russell presents is one that vexed Frege as well, and it concerns identity. If a definite description means what it denotes, and it denotes some object that could also be denoted by a proper name, such as the case of the British Prime Minister and Boris Johnson, then it can be hard to make sense of the meaning of claims of identity, claims such as the British Prime Minister is Boris Johnson. The example Russell uses in On Denoting is the following. George IV wished to know whether Scott was the author of Waverley. In this sentence, the author of Waverley is a definite description that seems to denote Walter Scott. But if Walter Scott is what the author of Waverley means, then it seems as though it means the same as the proper name Walter Scott. But that would make the sentence, George IV wished to know whether Scott was the author of Waverley, mean the same as George IV wished to know whether Scott was Scott, which is clearly not the case. No one wonders whether something is itself. Russell thinks that his theory of definite descriptions can solve the puzzle. For unlike the way he interprets definite descriptions, he thinks that the name Scott does directly refer to its object, Walter Scott. So in his theory, the example sentence is better expressed by saying, George IV wished to know whether there exists some X, such that X wrote Waverley, and nothing other than X wrote Waverley, and X was Scott. And he says this is clearly different in meaning from the sentence, George IV wished to know whether Scott was Scott. The second puzzle Russell presents is based on the logical principle of the law of excluded middle. This law says that if you have two sentences that are the opposite of each other, one must be true and the other must be false. But now he considers two sentences. The King of France is bald and the King of France is not bald. Since the second sentence is the negation of the first sentence, it seems as though one of these sentences must be true. But France has no king, so it doesn't seem as though either of these sentences can be true. As Russell puts it, if we have a list that has all of the bald things in it, and we have another list that has all of the not bald things in it, the King of France won't appear in either list. But according to the law of excluded middle, one of these sentences must be true. The way Russell uses his theory to deal with this case is probably the most famous of its applications. Russell's theory renders the King of France is bald as saying, something is a King of France, nothing else is a King of France, and it is also bald. And it renders the King of France is not bald as saying, something is a King of France, nothing else is a King of France, and it is also not bald. Because of this interpretation, both sentences come out false, because they both say that there is something that is a King of France, when there is no King of France. Regarding this part of what they claim, the sentences are not opposite at all. They are only opposite about what they say concerning their subject. The reason these sentences seem to be opposite is because one will always be true and the other will always be false if there is exactly one thing that fits the description. For example, exactly one of the Queen of England is bald and the Queen of England is not bald will be true. Now Russell accepts the law of excluded middle, and so he thinks that the false sentence, the King of France is bald, must have an opposite which must therefore be true. But because of how he interprets the sentence, the King of France is bald, what that opposite sentence is not what it might appear to be. According to Russell, the opposite sentence is, it is not the case that the King of France is bald. Or more explicitly, there is not something that is a King of France and nothing else is a King of France and it is also bald. Of course, he realises that in natural language we sometimes use the sentence, the King of France is not bald, to mean there is exactly one thing that is a King of France and it is also not bald, and sometimes to mean there is not exactly one thing that is a King of France and it is also bald. Russell says that it depends on whether the description is being used in a primary way, as in the first case, or a secondary way, as in the second. But although natural language can be ambiguous, the difference is made clear in logical notation, as it is a difference concerning where not, i.e. the negation sign, appears. The primary way would be written as indicated, while the secondary way would be written differently. As can be seen, in the first case, the negation sign appears before the be, and so expresses not baldness. In the second, it appears at the front of the sentence, and so expresses the not existence of something fitting the description. The third puzzle Russell considers is about how we can say truly that something doesn't exist. The puzzle is that if what we're talking about doesn't exist, then it's hard to know what it is we're even talking about. Similarly, if what we're talking about doesn't exist, then what is it that makes our saying that it doesn't exist true? Consider the sentence, the King of France does not exist. If this were interpreted as a case in which the description, the King of France had primary occurrence, we would translate it as saying, there is exactly one thing that is a King of France, and it also does not exist. It is when we understand the claim that the King of France does not exist in this primary way that we get confused. For since there is no King of France, it seems the claim can't be true. But we intended to say something that is true, and so we reached the puzzle. What has gone wrong, according to Russell, is that we intend to use the description in a secondary way, such that when we say the King of France does not exist, we really mean there is not exactly one thing that is a King of France and it also exists. When using the description in this secondary way, we indeed say something true, for there is nothing that is a King of France. So the puzzle arises, Russell thinks, from an ambiguity inherent in natural language, an ambiguity that Russell's theory of descriptions makes plain and resolves, and therefore helps us to escape the puzzle. But there is still a slight problem here when proper names are used instead of descriptions when making non-existence claims. If I say Frodo does not exist, and if Frodo behaves the way Russell says Scott behaves, then it seems as though there is only one interpretation available, namely that the object denoted by Frodo does not exist. But in this case we are back at the puzzle we began with of a true sentence without an existing subject. Russell's way out is to say that while Scott does denote Walter Scott directly, Frodo is really a substitute for a definite description drawn from our knowledge of the character, perhaps the hobbit that brought the One Ring to Mount Doom. Once this switch is made, we translate Frodo does not exist into the hobbit that brought the One Ring to Mount Doom does not exist, and Russell can use his usual trick to come up with a secondary occurrence translation that results in a true sentence. But the fact that Russell performs a description switch with the likes of Frodo, but not with the likes of Scott, seems fishy. It is made slightly less fishy when you combine it with another of Russell's theories about different kinds of knowledge, but explaining that theory would require another video. For now, we're done. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed it, please hit like and subscribe for more videos like this on deep philosophical topics. And, as always, have a wise day.